Thank you all so much for the invitation. Today, I'm going to talk about a project that we are doing at Texas A&M University and actually all throughout Texas called the Texas Climate Smart Initiative. And this project is really focused on soil carbon and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So usually I talk about research that's kind of in the past, but this time I'm going to talk a lot more about our plans for the future. So the Texas Climate Smart Initiative is the project that is funded at $65 million for the next 5 years. And it's funded through the United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources and Conservation Service. And there are about 70 projects in this type of program. And the goal of the programs are to incentivize the adoption of climate smart commodities, to measure, monitor, report, and verify climate smart benefits from the adoption of those climate smart commodities, and to develop markets and promote commodities. Our team is led by Texas A&M AgriLife, who I'm a member of. And Texas A&M AgriLife actually encompasses several different organizations, including the Texas A&M University College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, Texas A&M AgriLife Research, and the Texas A&M Forest Service. In addition, we have partners with the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board, which I'll kind of describe as probably not familiar to y'all, but it's an organization that has influence in every county or district in the state of Texas, but there's actually these same boards across the nation as well. Then we have 3 other academic institutions: Prairie View A&M University and University of Texas Rio Grande Valley and Charleston State University. And then we have 2 other partners. B Carbon is a nonprofit carbon aggregator, and Nori is a for-profit carbon aggregator who trade on the carbon market arena. And then on top of that, we have quite a few different commodity stakeholders and participants that have supported our project. So to kind of give an overview of this, our project scope, we had a lot of freedom to decide what our scope was, and some of these other projects that we were talking about that were funded, some of them have state focus, some of them have region focus, some of them have focus across the entire United States. We selected the state of Texas. It's quite of a large area with roughly 700,000 square kilometers of area. Our concept for this project is that no farm is the same. We may have a cotton farmer in North Texas that only grows cotton, or maybe does cotton and some cattle. We may have somebody in South Texas that does cotton and vegetables. We may have somebody in East Texas that might do cotton and pecans or some other crop. So because no farm is the same, we felt that we need to develop what we call climate smart management plans that are very farm specific. And this is really a concept that's based on those soil and water conservation districts that manage what's called a water management plan. So already in the United States, we have this basis of a water management plan that's deployed by these soil and water conservation districts. In Texas, there's almost 255 of these districts, almost one for every county or small regional governing unit. And they also have these all across the United States. So it's a great place to try to have a more local approach to this. We're trying to pilot this concept of using these districts to deploy these climate smart management plans to about 1,200 participants in this particular study. And so we have allocated about $40 million to incentivize the adoption for these participants and provide training, education, and even in some cases to provide some access to equipment, as we know that particularly for underserved participants, that may be difficult to adopt certain practices if they don't have the equipment to do it. Then when we assess the impact, that's where we get into the soil carbon storage and greenhouse gas emission reductions that we're trying to look for. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm not going to talk quite as much about the economics, but part of this project is also to figure out how to make this economical, because we know that we cannot actually get anyone to do practices if they're not economical, because there has to be either some government subsidy if these practices are expensive, or there has to be a market to pay for it. So we need to determine the cost of adoption, the willingness of consumers to pay for this product, and then develop those markets for these commodities, and potentially look at other avenues for economics like carbon markets that could potentially pay for or help subsidize these practices. So you might be thinking, why Texas? Why did we pick this as our scope? Well, I live in Texas, so that's partly why. But Texas has a very wide range of climates. A lot of people think about Texas in a particular scope because of TV or movies or something, but it's extremely arid in the far west, and it's extremely humid and wet in the far east. It's more temperate in the north and subtropical down south. So we have this huge gradient of climates, and there's also quite a range of soil types. We're also, in the United States, we are leading producers of cattle, which are grown all across the state, cotton, which is also grown pretty wide around the state. And then we're also one of the top producers of rice and a few other commodities. Rice is pretty much central, focused in the southeast part of the state. But we have all these other commodities. We have 22 million acres, which is about 11 million hectares for crop production, about 50 something hectares for grazing and hay production, and 50 hectares in forest. And I know a lot of people forget about forest being in Texas, but we do have a pretty large forest industry. The other thing that makes Texas a good place to start this pilot project is because the state is not particularly great at adopting these climate smart practices. There are regions and particular commodities that are good, but not necessarily, this is not necessarily something that all the places are adapted to. And we are also very susceptible to extreme weather that is anticipated from climate change. So there's a reason for the farmers to help mitigate it, not necessarily for mitigating climate change, but for making their operations more sustainable and resistant to drought, flood, extreme weather, which we are all affected from. In fact, we had baseball size hail only 2 weeks ago around here, and 2 years ago we had record freezing temperatures, and last year we had a record drought. So these are very things that we are definitely experiencing, and people are waking up and realizing that we need to be resistant to these types of stresses on agriculture. So part of the program requires us to use established practices or proven practices that have some sort of record of being successful. I'm probably not going to go through all these in detail, but you can imagine that cover cropping, reduced tillage type of practices are common for our row crops and vegetable production and livestock, focusing on animal diet manipulation, prescribed grazing or controlling the stubble height of your grain to make sure that we're building that biomass of the crop, looking at planting, particularly overseeding or perennialization, switching those feed to more perennial crops instead of annual crops, are things we're looking on the livestock side. And then also I kind of divided animal manure out because there are whole separate practices for confined animal operations where they need to manage the manure or treat the manure or separate the manure, and all of those practices that can reduce greenhouse gases or have that manure reapplied to the land as a carbon source are all things that would be encouraged for this. The project does not allow us to fund the digesters, but any practice that facilitate digesters are also encouraged. And then in forestry, we're really focusing on small acreage forest. These are forests that don't really get much management because when you have a large forest, you have the equipment and the resources to thin and cull some of the bad trees and try to get really healthy tree growth. But in the small forest, they can't afford it. So we have some strategies that we're working to unite those farmers so that collectively together they can improve their forest stand. Also, places where they've cut the forest down to reestablish those forests is another focus of this project, but some of these other practices as well that may actually fit more into the row crop, adding buffer plantings along rivers and things like that. So our goal in the assessing impact, which is probably the most important part, is we're going to use a variety of techniques. So obviously we're going to quantify soil organic carbon using combustion. And so we'll take soil cores and do all that, but then we're also going to try some other techniques. We're also going to quantify changes in greenhouse gas emission, and we're going to use both discrete sampling at 20% of the sites and continuous monitoring at 5 sites, both with and without the practices. So we can really quantify how are these practices changing our storage of carbon and our emissions. But our other goal is to figure out what the best low-cost strategy to do this. And so those are kind of our baseline pieces of information. And then we're going to look also at modeling existing models, such as the COMET model, which is one of the ones the USDA is promoting, as well as other models, and developing new models, particularly one for the large animal operations, because the manure management, some of those models don't actually exist for our systems. We also are going to look at remote sensing. We have some carbon sensors that we're going to look at. The carbon sensors, I guess I have in the past been very skeptical of this, but I've seen some results that may have some promise. At least that calibrated and combined with some soil combustion may be a way to reduce that cost and allow more frequent sampling without quite as much expense. So probably some sort of combination of techniques might be the best ideal. And because there's so many different commodities in this program, we have the ability to look at what might be best for different commodities or different regions, because there could be some differences. And so that's kind of the next part, is we want to determine practices or factors that contribute to the greatest climate smart benefits. And so we know that we have this opportunity in Texas to take advantage of the diverse climate, the diversity in soils, the diversity in commodities, to provide opportunities to identify things like effective practices. Which are those climate smart practices that are most effective? Maybe that's it by a specific region, or maybe there's a specific commodity that should be targeted. Validate those assessment practices also by region and commodity, because what works really well in the desert may not work really well in the east. What may work in a very clay soil may not work very well in a sandy soil. Also, we need to extrapolate these benefits if practices were scaled up to accommodate for the different amounts of land use and different management practices, and look at the cost of practices relative to their benefit. And then we also would like to see how our project is changing perceptions. So right now, as I mentioned, a lot of people in Texas are not very, they're not very eager to adopt. And we believe this is largely due to economics. And they have a perception that it's not going to work for them in their operation. But we are also trying to, on top of that, see if we're changing people's perception about the adoption. So this project, to answer all these questions, we have about 75 different scientists working at various different levels, about 5 postdocs, more than 14 graduate students. I have trouble counting because I don't have all the numbers from the other partners that we have at the other institutions, but I know there's 14 at Texas A&M. And we also have some undergraduates working as well. So we have a good team of people to help work on this. So then the economic incentive plan. So throughout all of this, we are trying to make sure that not only we're working on the farmers' operations to monitor, measure, and verify all these climate smart benefits, we are also want to find out, is this affecting their economics? So the first thing we would do would be try to just evaluate this cost of adoption. What does it cost the first year? What does it cost the second year, third year, so that we can kind of get an idea. And then we also want to see if carbon markets, there's a lot of people in Texas do not feel like carbon markets are going to be very helpful, because they don't feel like, especially in the West, there's not a lot of soil carbon. So we want to find out, is that true? Or are there places where we can really make inputs, and over a large scale, it may make a difference. So we have both the carbon aggregators are going to work. They're going to take 5 case studies in different regions that focus in their area and see which one works better. Then we're going to work to develop markets, maybe create branding and marketing strategies. For example, maybe we need some climate smart clothing, or maybe we have climate smart meat or climate smart vegetable products. So we're going to try to create market opportunities. We're going to make sure that we trace them through the supply chain so that there's a clear path from one to another. And then evaluate, which I think this is kind of one of the interesting things, evaluate consumer willingness to pay for this. You know, what is the consumer willing to pay for a climate smart shirt versus climate smart beef versus maybe climate smart wood, for example. So we're trying to develop markets, and hopefully these markets will help pay the farmer, or at least provide the farmer with some additional revenue to adopt better, be more willing to adopt these practices. So we're really trying to take this to transition Texas towards sustainability and profitability, while also trying to mitigate climate change, because we really feel like these climate smart practices have a mutual benefit. There's a benefit to the farmer, because hopefully these practices are adding carbon, which allows the soil to hold more water, allows the plant to be more resilient against drought. Maybe it also allows water to drain through because the soil has better structure. So maybe it's more resilient against flooding, reduce erosion, and more sustainable practices overall. And then on top of that, we have the ability to have the ability to hopefully, as a collective operation, to sequester carbon and reduce emissions, so that we're also making the climate change less of a problem. So those are the things that we're working on for this project. And what I think is really fun is that a lot of the projects for this Climate Smart Commodities program are very focused on one commodity. For example, there's some other projects that Texas A&M is working on. One of them is focused solely on sorghum. Another one is focused solely on cotton. There's another one focused solely on livestock. And so in this project, we're trying to focus on the farmer and try to figure out what is the best for that farmer, because we think that that's the approach that might work on a nationwide scale, because we don't know if the person is growing onions or cucumbers or cattle or cotton, and we want all of our commodity producers to help us with climate change, because we feel that's the only way that we're going to make a difference. So thank you for listening to me.